We we will start recording and we'll start going. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, so welcome to Community Conversations, Turning the Page, Anti-Racism Book Club. This series is sponsored by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Cabinet, the Office of International Programs, and the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. So I want to say a big thank you. I'm Christina Bridges. I'm a researcher in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health Research Division. So thank you all for being here. I think some of you have been here before, and maybe some new people, and we're glad you're here. So I just wanted to start out naming the purpose of this club so that we're all sort of on the same footing. So it was designed and we've been intentional about wanting to understand history, the history of racism, or the history of this country, the patterns of racism we've seen in this country, and the systems that we're all part of. This book club is a place to learn, but also to practice talking about racism and racial disparities. And so we'll use a small group breakout session feature after I give an overview of a couple chapters of the book. This is a place for personal learning and growth to create a shift within individuals. And this sometimes happens by provoking an emotional state. So whether it's discomfort, empathy, outrage, something that raises our consciousness. And with the overall goal being for us to commit to action and systems change. And so, as I mentioned, we'll use small groups, and we have peer facilitators from all different levels. We have faculty, staff, students, kind of a range that will lead our small group sessions and lead asking some of the questions. And we want to use continuum language. So, we're all on the spectrum of, some of us have been doing this work for just a short time. Others of you have been doing it for decades, and we appreciate that and realize that we all have learning to do. Okay, so this is the first of 4 sessions that we'll spend talking about the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? By Beverly Daniel Tatum. She's a psychologist and she's an expert in the psychology of racism, racial identity development. And we will jump in. She sort of breaks up her book into 4 parts, so that's helpful, and we're just going to follow along with that. So she starts her book by using a quote from James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." She says that it's common for her to hear someone ask in her presentations, isn't racism a thing of the past? And she says, this is almost certainly someone who hasn't noticed the effects of racism. Stereotypical messages, images of people of color in the media, housing discrimination in their community, documented racial bias in lending practices among well-known banks, accounts of racial tracking patterns in schools, disproportionate incarceration and police killings of people of color, and racial health disparities in every domain of health, including life expectancy. So no, racism is not a thing of the past. She begins talking about the impact of racism and how this begins early. And so some of the impact from our society are the societal norms that are formed by the dominant racial group. So this is determining who is beautiful, who is presented as beautiful, thought of as beautiful, what features are praised, who is powerful, who's seen as powerful, who is seen as smart, who is a criminal, who are our heroes. All of these messages wash over all of us as we grow up. She says we live in segregated communities, so this gives us limited information about other racial groups. And with that limited information is where stereotypes, omissions of knowledge of others, and distortions can contribute to our prejudice. And of course, we know prejudice is a preconceived judgment or opinion, usually based on limited information. She says research shows that even 3-year-olds hold stereotypes, racial stereotypes, that become the foundation of prejudice. And of course, all of this that we're brought up with is internalized. So if we're in the dominant group, we internalize superiority and seeing our image mirrored back in our society. If we are in a minoritized group, we internalize inferiority. So she says we all have prejudices, not because we want them, but because we have been continually exposed to misinformation about others. We're not to blame for the negative messages we internalized. She says, prejudice is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. So reading that quote reminded me of a quote I heard from Ibram X. Kendi, the historian and anti-racist scholar, when he was doing an interview on the Brene Brown podcast. So I'm just going to play you a short clip here, about 1 minute. Oops.
To grow up in America is to grow up and for racist ideas to constantly be rained on your head, and you have no umbrella, and you don't even know that you're wet with those racist ideas, because the racist ideas themselves cause you to imagine that you're dry. Right. And then someone comes along and says, you know what, you're wet, and these ideas are still raining on your head. Here's an umbrella. You can be like, thank you. I didn't even realize I was drenched. Yeah. And then the question, this is why I don't think people should feel ashamed, is there were other people and very powerful people in a history that was constantly raining those ideas on your head.
Oops, I go back. Okay. So we are not, it's not our fault, but we are responsible. We are responsible for acknowledging and examining our prejudice. We can do this by looking at our own behavior. Am I perpetuating or challenging prejudices? Am I seeking exposure to positive images of marginalized groups? And all of this takes conscious acts of reflection and re-education. So that's prejudice. So what is racism? Because they're not the same. She starts by saying, racism is not just personal ideology based on racial prejudice. Racism is a system of economic, political, social, cultural structures, actions, and beliefs that perpetuate an unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between racial groups. Another way to say it is racism equals racial prejudice plus social power. And so we know that in our country, after hundreds of years of anti-Black specifically, and more generally pro-white racial prejudice, which was born to justify slavery, yet maintained as a political tool of control through Jim Crow, segregation, and mass incarceration, that the dominant form of racial prejudice in our country is anti-Black, anti-people of color. And so this, plus the social power of, white people being the ones that could vote, the ones that could own land, the ones that could amass power, which fast forward, that means that for the majority of the existence of our country, those who have been in the position to make decisions, so decisions about the military, the government, what books are published, what movies are made, what music is produced, what news is put out there, all of this has majority been by white people. And so this is what is described as white supremacy, where white people are in the position to disseminate and protect their self-image, their worldview, and their interests across the entire society. And so when she presents this to audiences, inevitably they will ask, are you saying all white people are racist? And what she says is, she's determined that what is really being asked is, are you saying all white people are bad? And she says, of course not. That is not what we're saying. But she says the more relevant question is, what are white people as individuals doing to interrupt racism? And so she describes racism as active racism. And this is the old definition, kind of what you would imagine the KKK or the Archie Bunker types spewing explicitly racist ideas. But then there's also passive racism, and this is probably the larger portion of racism. And this is just laughing at racist jokes, letting them go by unchallenged, letting exclusionary hiring practices go unchallenged, accepting the omissions of people of color from curriculum or from meetings or boards, and avoiding difficult race-related issues and conversations because it's uncomfortable. So she says, all that is required to maintain racism is to go about business as usual. This is my favorite quote, and some of you may have heard this before from Beverly Daniel Tatum, and it really gives a good image of this idea of active and passive racism. I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racist ahead of them, and choose to turn around. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. So a central theme to this book and to her philosophy of undoing racism is this idea of racial identity development. So this is defining the personal significance and social meaning of belonging to a particular racial group. She says that people belonging to the dominant social group, so in our society that would be white, male, heterosexual, etc., typically take those identities for granted. And she said in her classes that she'll often do this exercise where she says, please complete the sentence, I am blank. And so people will then list lots of things about their personality or where they're from or different things. And she says she sees a pattern. And so, women will say, I am a woman. People of color will list their race. Gay people will say, I am gay. But she says, white people never list their race. Men never say, I'm a man. Heterosexuals never say, I'm a heterosexual. So it's these dominant identities that go unnoticed. She says there are at least 7 categories of otherness in US society. And so the categories of otherness are, whatever is not the dominant. So the categories are race or ethnicity, gender expression, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, and physical or mental ability. And then you can see with each category, there is a form of oppression or an ism that goes with that. And in each case, there is a group considered dominant, which is systematically advantaged by society just because of group membership, and a group considered minoritized or targeted, systematically disadvantaged. And she points out that most of us will find that we are both dominant and targeted in different categories. But it is the targeted identities that hold our attention and the dominant identities that go often unexamined. And Tatum says, oppression happens at all levels. So this figure I actually found in a different publication by the author, but I just thought it really nicely illustrates how oppression happens at all different levels. And so you have at the individual level, feelings, belief, values, and the interpersonal level, actions, behaviors, language, institutional, the legal system, education system, public policy, and at the societal and cultural level, collective ideas about what is right. And so she points out, your targeted identities, you're going to feel discrimination and oppression at each of these levels. So this is all I wanted to cover from the book this time. And in a minute, we'll be dismissed into our breakout rooms, and we have a list of questions that we want to talk about. But I wanted to bring up this idea of action, because it comes up in every session just about that we have, where it's, well, we're learning and we're talking, but what about action? We need some action. And then people often say, I don't know what to do. And, there's kind of a back and forth. But because our ultimate goal is stopping racism and not just learning and talking about it, I would like to talk about action at each of our sessions. So, oppression happens at each level of society. I thought we could frame our discussion using this the social ecological model. And this model was brought up back in the summer if you attended any of those very large 300-person community conversations about racism that Dr. McGee led. That this was brought up by different faculty members here at KU, that we can use the social ecological model, because it gives us a nice framework to figure out what can we as individuals do, how can we achieve action at each of the levels. And so the goal is not to just have this pretty rainbow colored framework. Yeah.
This is Geraldine. I'm sorry. Is anyone else hearing that besides me, or is it just me? Okay.
I just sent a message.
I'm hearing it as well.
It's like your microphone, Dr. Bridges, got touched, or it's getting hit.
Oh,
Something's changed. Okay. It's like you moved papers or something and it hit the microphone.
Is it better now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sorry. Should I start over on this slide?
No, I think you're good.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say, that our goal isn't to just have a pretty framework and to feel good about, saying some things that in ways that we can act, but it is basically to empower us to see that even the work that we're doing, the learning work, the talking work, they fit into this and they are important, but that we can also find ways for each of us to enact change at these more higher levels. And we have a lot to figure out. So, how do we measure change? How do we keep each other accountable? And, how do we focus our efforts to have the most meaningful change? And I hope that in this group, we can talk about this together. So just wanted to bring this up and introduce it. And I want to keep bringing it back every time and talking about it. Okay. So Alexa, now you can dismiss us into our small groups, and we have some questions. Hello, welcome back. Thank you all for being here. We were having a great conversation. Does anyone want to share some things that your group talked about? Feel free to use the chat or feel free to just speak up.
Hey, our group we had a really great group, and they really kept it personal, either to themselves or to their department. And I really found that refreshing, and something that I, just want to see more of is people like identifying these questions and trying to relate to themselves in their department. And we had some folks talk about their struggles and frustrations with their department and successes with their department and with their personal life. And I think that one of the things we talked about is trying to focus on yourself first. How do we work through these things personally with myself of how I feel about race, what racism is to me, who I am as an individual, and then being able to start to develop a solid base to be able to then go out and try to exact any type of leverage or make any change in the community you can. But a lot of folks talked about starting with themselves first. Gina, is there anything else I'm missing?
No, Todd, that's great. That's a good summary. Thank you.
Thank you. That kind of reminds me of what we were just talking about in our group, which was, you know, making it personal in the context of a relationship. So you might be exposed to people of color outside of your, you know, immediate world. But Hakima was in our group and had mentioned that unless you're in relationship, you know, with someone from a different racial group, then you're not honestly, you know, working through, I forget how do you want to say how you put it, Hakima? I'm not going to speak for you.
No, I mean, you were just summarizing, which is fine, but I would say that yes, the relationship is really the grounding substance of this work, and that if you're not in relationship with actual Black people, then uh, then it's all theory, it's all philosophical, you know, it's all intellectual exercise, but relationship is the real learning ground. Everything else is just to get you ready for that.
And I would argue that you can be in relationships. I mean, I am married to a Black man, and our children are all different races. And I still am learning so much that I didn't know before. Just recently, like, I just now have the words to articulate some of the situations and experiences that we have as a couple. But I also want to admit how ignorant I was to uh, systemic racism and my privilege as a white person. And, you know, I've always been in relationships with people from different countries, different cultures, different ethnicities, and always been in a biracial relationship. But it's really, I'm still been very ignorant about a lot of these dynamics specific to American race relations and racial systemic racism. And I know Todd, he's going to be gracious, but I've said really dumb things. He knows that. So you can be you can be married to a Black man and still be very ignorant. And so this journey for me is also very personal because my children, you know, are biracial, and I love the book we're reading. I wish I'd had it, you know, my oldest daughter's 27, wish I had had it 27. It was around. Let me take responsibility. Stuff was around. I was ignorant and didn't even, you know, seek how to inform those conversations. So
I think your point is well taken, Kimberly, that you can totally be in relationship and be avoiding this work. You can absolutely do that. And interestingly enough, I find people in interracial romantic relationships are the worst culprits of that. They let just the fact that they're in those relationships be the stand-in for doing the work. And I was interracially married for 30 years, so I'm speaking of myself too.
And I will say that you can be Black or African in my case and be totally ignorant as well, because I'll join you there, Kimberly, because, you know, I was the girl that would say, I don't see color. Black, I don't see color. And to a lot of people, it's like, what do you mean by that? And over time is how you learn. It's through these relationships, through these trainings, through these meetings, through these conversations, that's how we start to learn more about who we are and how we can be better. So to anyone feeling guilty out there, hey, you got one other person here that is doing pretty much the same thing. We're all making mistakes and we're all growing and learning from it. So Kim, don't beat yourself too hard on that one.
Margaret, thank you. I love that example. What was I going to say? That made me think of, right, that idea of colorblindness, I think ultimately came probably originally from a place of good intention, but we know obviously intention and impact are different. But it makes me think of our intention when we read things about anti-racism or even go to trainings and go to groups, we have good intentions, but a lot of us have been talking about how do we evaluate the impact of it, because one impact can actually be when you come up to the discomfort, you know, maybe the guilt or shame, or you start to feel bad about yourself, that you can then, you know, if you don't go towards that discomfort, you can grow resentment, and kind of these types of things can have the opposite impact. So that idea has been brought up a lot recently to me. So I just wanted us to maybe all keep that in mind, that unless we're going towards the discomfort and through the discomfort, you know, there's a possibility that we can just kind of lock ourselves in at resentment.
Or not only resentment, or just indifference, right? Just get into your shell and say, it's overwhelming. It's too much to deal with. I don't have answers and I don't know what to do about it. And then so I'm not going to do anything. And that's what MLK has said was the biggest barrier to addressing this issue is people being indifferent, the mediocre middle.
All right. Does anyone have one last thing to share?
I share that I just want to say that I know that a lot of white people might have discomfort speaking out because, you know, they have family members and things that they don't want to create tension with, but I just want to encourage them to really speak out for people of color, because it is kind of sad to say, but I am vocal a lot of times. I post a lot of things, and it's sad to say that, you know, people might not listen to me more than they might listen to a white person. So just think about how you can be an ally. So.
Thank you, Anna. That's a great, I was going to leave you all with the idea of just thinking about how you can act. And that's a great one, Anna, to go towards the discomfort of speaking to people who you know are probably in disagreement with these ideas, but to talk to them anyway. But also, as Todd said in his group, to keep it personal, work on yourself first. Okay, thank you all. It's 1 o'clock. We'll meet again next month. Thanks a lot.